The year was 1887, and the sun over the Arizona-New Mexico territory was a hammer, beating the land flat and scorching the color from the sky. Dust was not merely on the ground, it was the air itself, a fine red powder that coated the tongue, settled in the folds of a dress, and worked its way into the soul. Evelyn Hart felt it as a second skin. At 21, she believed her life had already been ground down to a similar powder, fine and useless. The stagecoach groaned, a long, weary complaint of wood and leather that had become the rhythm of her days. Inside, the heat was a physical presence, pressing in from all sides. Evelyn sat straight-backed, her hands clasped in her lap, trying to maintain an air of composure she did not feel. Her dress, a practical gray broadcloth chosen for durability, not beauty, was damp against her skin. She was the daughter of a failed merchant, a man whose careful ledgers and hopeful ventures had been consumed by a bad investment and 2 seasons of drought, leaving the family with nothing but debts and the bitter taste of shame. He had called her his songbird, but the music had long since died in her throat. Now, she was a burden, another mouth to feed in a household that had shrunk to fit its diminished means. This journey to the frontier town of Drywater was her declaration of independence, a desperate bid to become useful, to the world, and to the gruff stagecoach driver, Jebediah. She was just another woman heading west, perhaps to marry a stranger or take up a domestic post. She let them believe it. Her true purpose was a secret she held tight as a prayer to find her cousin, William. His letters, once filled with wild tales of gold fever and the promise of a life remade, had stopped 6 months ago. The last one had spoken of Drywater, of a new silver and copper strike, and of a company called Red Butte Mining. A gnawing worry had taken root in her heart, a fear that William, with his trusting nature and thirst for adventure, had stumbled into something deeper and darker than a simple mine shaft. She had to find him. She had to be more than the girl who sat by the window watching her family's dreams turn to dust. The coach lurched, pulling her from her thoughts. Outside, the landscape was a vast canvas of rust and ochre, dotted with the skeletal arms of saguaro and the stubborn green of creosote bushes. It was a place that swallowed sound, a place of immense and intimidating silence. Jebediah cursed under his breath, reining in the 4 tired horses. Ahead, a blackened circle scarred the earth, the remains of a camp. A wagon burned down to its iron skeleton, lay like the bones of some prehistoric beast. A strange quiet fell over the passengers. Even the incessant creaking of the coach seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn leaned out, her heart a cold knot in her chest. She saw scattered debris, a broken crate, the dark stain of something spilled and soaked into the thirsty ground. There was no sign of life, only the lingering scent of cold ash and a profound sense of violation. Bandits, a nervous salesman sitting opposite her, whispered, his face pale. Jebediah spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Or just trouble. Out here, they're often the same thing. He cracked his whip, and the horses moved on. But the image of the ruined camp stayed with Evelyn, a stark reminder of the fragility of things in this unforgiving land. The West did not care for hopes or dreams. It demanded resilience, and she feared she had none left to give. Night fell not as a gentle blanket, but as a sudden, deep purple flood that washed away the horizon and brought a deceptive coolness to the air. With the dark came the sounds, the chirr of insects, the distant, lonely cry of a coyote, then another cry, closer, and another, answering from a different direction. A collective tension filled the coach. The horses grew skittish, their ears twitching, their breath coming in nervous puffs. Jebediah's grip on the reins tightened. Wolves, he grunted. Big ones, by the sound of it. Evelyn could see them now, fleeting shapes in the periphery, moving with a liquid grace through the scrub. Then, a pair of eyes, luminous green, caught the faint moonlight. Then another pair, and another. They were circling, a silent, patient perimeter of hunger. It was then that the world tilted. A sharp, violent crack, like a rifle shot, echoed from beneath them. The left rear of the coach dropped with a sickening crunch of splintering wood. Evelyn was thrown against the salesman. The breath knocked from her lungs. The coach ground to a halt at a severe angle, its axle broken. The great wooden wheels shattered. They were stranded. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the humid confines of the coach. The salesman began to pray in a frantic undertone. Jebediah, his face a grim mask in the gloom, reached for his rifle. The circle of eyes drew closer. The low, guttural growls were no longer distant. Just as a profound despair began to settle over Evelyn, a feeling that this was the end of her futile journey, a change occurred. A subtle shift in the night. The wolves, which had been pressing forward, suddenly hesitated. Their growls turned to uncertain whimpers. They looked not at the coach, but past it, into the darkness of the high plateau. A figure emerged from that darkness. He did not seem to walk, but to materialize from the shadows, as if the land itself had given him form. He was tall and lean, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of absolute confidence in this environment. He carried no lantern, yet he navigated the treacherous ground as if it were a sunlit path. He was Navajo. That much was clear from his bearing. The simple cotton shirt and buckskin trousers, the single feather tied in his long, dark hair. He was a man of perhaps 30 years, his face a collection of harsh, beautiful angles, his eyes holding the ancient stillness of the canyons. He paid the humans in the broken coach no mind. His attention was solely on the wolves. He made no sudden moves. He simply raised a hand and spoke a single, low word in his own tongue. It was not a shout, but it carried an authority that cut through the night. He then struck a match, its flare momentarily illuminating the sharp line of his jaw, and lit a tightly bound bundle of what looked like dried herbs. He swung the smoking bundle in a slow arc. The pungent, clean scent of sage filled the air, and the wolves, as if repelled by an invisible wall, broke their circle and melted back into the night. Silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. The man then turned his gaze to the coach. His eyes met Evelyn's for a fleeting moment, and she felt an unnerving sensation of being seen, not just as a woman, but as a collection of fears and hopes, all laid bare. He spoke to Jebediah, his English spare and heavily accented, broken. Not safe here. He pointed with his chin toward a dark mass of rock formations a quarter-mile away. Better ground. High. There was no room for argument. Under the man's silent, watchful guidance, they gathered what they could. He moved with a quiet efficiency, helping Jebediah unhitch the panicked horses, his presence alone a calming influence on the animals. He led them away from the vulnerable road and up a winding, almost invisible trail to a shallow overhang protected by a jumble of massive boulders, a natural fortress. He built a small, smokeless fire with a skill that seemed like magic, producing dry tinder and flint from a pouch at his belt. The flames pushed back the oppressive darkness and revealed the silent man more clearly. Tanat Ani. He watched the fire, his face impassive. His stillness was not empty. It was watchful, alert to every whisper of the wind, every shift in the shadows. He seemed a part of the landscape, as ancient and enduring as the rocks that sheltered them. He harbored a quiet sorrow, a shadow in his eyes that the firelight could not touch, a memory of a past raid, of a duty he could not fulfill. He had learned the hard way that distance was a form of protection, for himself and for the sacred places he guarded, like the canyon of quiet water. Evelyn found herself studying him, this stranger who had appeared like a spirit from the earth. She felt a strange sense of security in his presence, a feeling that was utterly at odds with their desperate situation. She, who felt so useless, was watching a man who was the complete master of his world. They spent the night huddled near the fire. No one spoke much. The enormity of the desert and their own insignificance seemed to enforce a shared silence. Tanat Ani sat slightly apart, a silent guardian, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond their small circle of light. When dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in hues of rose and pale gold. He was gone. There was no sound of his departure. It was as if he had dissolved with the morning mist. The only evidence he had ever been there was the still warm ashes of the fire and a neat set of moccasin prints leading away into the wilderness. And one other thing, tied to the splintered axle of the broken coach, a small, fresh bundle of white sage, identical to the one he had used to drive away the wolves, swayed gently in the morning breeze. A ward against evil spirits, a gesture of protection. As Jebediah and the salesman began the arduous task of jury-rigging the wheel, Evelyn noticed something else. Near the road, in the soft earth, were other tracks. Not the scuffed, aimless prints of bandits. These were the clear, deep impressions of heavy boots, methodical and purposeful, accompanied by small holes in the ground, as if someone had been driving stakes. They followed a line, heading straight toward the distant, hazy outline of dry water. A cold unease settled upon her, deeper than the fear of wolves or the desolation of the burned-out camp. The men who had been lurking in the dark had not been common highwaymen. They had been surveyors, scouts for something far more organized and relentless. Her cousin William's letter echoed in her mind. The mention of Red Butte Mining and its powerful manager, a former Army officer named Colton Briggs. The broken wheel was more than an inconvenience. It was an omen. Her path had been violently diverted. She had come seeking a lost boy caught up in gold fever, but she was beginning to understand that she had stumbled into a war. It was a war for the land itself, for the water hidden beneath its parched skin, and for the soul of the town called Dry Water. The bundle of sage on the broken axle felt less like a charm and more like a prayer for the journey that now lay before her. Dry Water was less a town and more a raw wound on the landscape. A collection of unpainted wooden buildings clinging to a dusty street under the relentless Arizona sun. The heart of the place was the public well, its stone lip worn smooth by countless hands and buckets, and its wooden crank groaning in constant protest. Already, Evelyn could see the water level was low, a worrying depth of dark, damp stone visible before the first glint of the surface. Dominating the skyline, a half-mile distant, was the skeletal headframe of the Red Butte mine, a constant, clanking reminder of who held the town's leash. Evelyn secured a room at the boarding house run by a woman named May, a widow whose sharp eyes missed nothing. May's face was a roadmap of a hard life, but her smile was genuine, and her wit was as dry as the creek bed that gave the town its name. The house was clean, smelled of baking bread and lye soap, and was, for Evelyn, a small island of order in a sea of chaos. "Looking for work?" dear May asked, her hands busy kneading dough on a floured countertop. "I am," Evelyn replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I can read and write, and I have some knowledge of tending to the sick." May raised a skeptical eyebrow. "The only man in town who pays for that kind of help is Dr. Townsend. He is a good man, but he is set in his ways as a mule in a mud hole. Thinks a woman's place is anywhere but in his office." Despite the warning, Evelyn presented herself to Dr. Townsend the next morning. His office was a cluttered room smelling of carbolic acid and dust, with medical texts stacked precariously on every surface. He was an old man with a fringe of white hair and a perpetually sour expression, as if he had just bitten into a lemon. He peered at her over his spectacles, his skepticism plain. "An assistant," he grumbled. After she made her request, "I do not need an assistant. I need someone to boil bandages and sweep the floor." "I can do that," Evelyn said evenly. "I can also organize your ledgers, inventory your supplies, and mix poultices. I learn quickly." He harumphed, but his gaze lingered on a towering pile of paperwork threatening to avalanche onto the floor. He needed help, whether he wanted to admit it or not. $2 a week, and you will not touch my surgical instruments. It was a start. Evelyn threw herself into the work, bringing a semblance of order to the chaos of his office. It was during this task, while sorting through a crate of patient accounts, that she discovered the town's other, less visible, sickness. The ledgers for the miners were separate. They were not accounts for medical services, but for debts owed to the Red Butte Mining Company's store. She saw pages filled with charges for flour, beans, blasting powder, and shovels, all at prices that seemed impossibly high. Beside each entry was a column for interest, calculated weekly at a rate that would make a loan shark blush. Men were digging themselves deeper into debt with every swing of their pickaxes, their labor barely covering the cost of their own survival. The ledgers were a form of bondage, written in neat, clear script. She saw the name Colton Briggs in the margins, his initials approving a new line of credit or foreclosing on another man's meager hopes. She met the man himself a few days later. He strode down the main street as if he owned it, which, in a way, he did. He was a big man, built like a bull, with a clean-shaven jaw and cold, calculating eyes that seemed to take in everything and value nothing. A silver star was pinned to his vest, proclaiming him the head of mine security, but he moved with the swagger of a warlord. Flanking him was Deputy Hale, a weaselly man with a perpetual smirk who seemed to exist only to echo Briggs's authority. Evelyn watched from the window of the doctor's office as Briggs settled a dispute between two miners. The argument was over a canteen of water. Briggs did not mediate. He adjudicated with his fists. He knocked one man to the ground, unconscious, and sent the other stumbling away, his face a mask of terror. "Water belongs to the mine," Briggs announced to the silent onlookers. "You get your share when you have earned it." His gaze swept the street, daring anyone to challenge him, and met Evelyn's. For a moment, their eyes locked. She saw no anger in his, no passion, only a flat, chilling sense of ownership. She felt a tremor of fear, but forced herself to hold his gaze until he looked away, dismissing her. "He is the law in dry water," May told her that evening, her voice low, the company's law. In the evenings, at the boarding house dinner table, Evelyn listened. She listened to the tired miners, their voices rough with dust and fatigue. They spoke of the dangers in the shafts, of crumbling rock and bad air, and they spoke in whispers of a place called the Canyon of Quiet Water. It was a local legend, a box canyon hidden deep in the hills, a place the Navajo held sacred. Rumor said a vein of pure silver and rich copper ran through it like a river of stone, but Briggs had declared it off limits, posting guards on the trails leading into that territory, claiming it was for their own safety. The men suspected otherwise. They believed Red Butte wanted the canyon for itself. The Navajo kept their distance. Evelyn would sometimes see them at the edge of town, ghosts of the land that had once been theirs, among them. She once caught a glimpse of a tall, familiar figure. It was Tanat Ani, the man from the high plateau. He stood by a lone juniper tree, his back straight, his presence a silent rebuke to the noisy, grasping town. He was trading with a merchant, exchanging a bundle of dried herbs for a sack of salt and a small box of cartridges. Their eyes met across the dusty expanse. There was no sign of recognition on his face, only that same unnerving stillness she remembered. He finished his business and was gone, vanishing back into the landscape that had birthed him. He was a guardian, she realized, not just of a place, but of a way of life the mine was intent on destroying. One sweltering afternoon, a scream cut through the drowsy quiet of the town. A small boy, the son of a Mexican family who lived in a shack at the edge of town, had been thrown from a donkey. Evelyn was the first to reach him. He lay in the dust, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle, a deep gash on his forehead bleeding freely. His mother was hysterical. Without a second thought, Evelyn went to work. She spoke to the mother in calm, soothing tones, tearing a strip from her own petticoat to press against the wound. "Get me clean water and soap," she commanded the small crowd that had gathered. When Dr. Townsend arrived, puffing and complaining, he found Evelyn gently washing the grit from the gash. "What do you think you are doing?" he demanded. "What you should be doing," she replied without looking up. He needs stitches, and his arm is broken." Grumbling, the old doctor was forced to concede her competence. He watched, offering gruff corrections, as she helped him clean and stitch the wound, and then held the boy steady while he set the bone and fashioned a splint. In that moment, tending to the frightened child, Evelyn felt a flicker of the purpose she had been so desperate to find. She was not useless. She could help. The boy, whose name was Mateo, developed a hacking cough a few days later, a common affliction in the dust-choked town. Evelyn prepared a syrup of honey and lemon for him, but it did little good. One morning, Mateo's mother found a small, deerskin pouch on her doorstep. Inside was a handful of dark, wild seeds and a few dried leaves. There were no words, no indication of who had left it. The woman, trusting the old ways, brewed a tea from the contents. By evening, Mateo's cough had eased, his breathing no longer a painful rasp. When his mother showed Evelyn the pouch, she knew instantly. The clean, earthy scent of the leaves was familiar. It was the same scent that had driven away the wolves. Ta Nata'ani had been watching. He had seen a need and met it, quietly, invisibly, leaving no trace but a small act of healing. A week later, a letter was delivered to the boarding house. It was addressed simply to Evelyn Hart. The handwriting was a rough, unfamiliar scrawl. May handed it to her with a curious look. Evelyn took it to her room, her heart beginning to pound. It was not from her family. She knew their script as well as her own. Her fingers trembled as she broke the cheap wax seal. The paper inside was coarse, folded once. She opened it, expecting a message, a demand, an explanation, but the page was blank, almost. In the center of the sheet was a single, stark impression, a thumbprint, pressed into the paper with what could only have been blood. It was dark, ugly, and undeniably human. A cold dread, far sharper than any fear she had felt on the road, washed over her. It was not a letter. It was a warning, and it was a clue. Someone knew she was looking for her cousin William, and they were telling her that his story had not ended well. Her search was no longer just for a missing person. It was an investigation into a death. The blast came just after dawn, a low, gut-wrenching concussion that rolled through dry water and rattled the teeth of everyone in it. It was not the familiar, punctual boom of the mine's daily blasting schedule. This was different, deeper, wrong. Evelyn felt it in the floorboards of the boarding house, a tremor that spoke of a great and terrible violence done to the earth. Men spilled out of the saloon and the bunkhouses, their faces etched with confusion and alarm. The source was a massive cloud of dust rising from the hills behind the mine, where the company had been building a new retaining wall to create a reservoir. By midday, the truth had trickled down into the town like a dying stream. A miscalculated charge had brought half the hillside down, not into the reservoir, but onto the narrow creek that was the town's only reliable source of water. The flow was choked to a muddy trickle. Panic did not set in immediately. It began as a low murmur, a quiet calculation of how much was left in the rain barrels, how long the well could last under the strain of a whole town drawing from it. By the second day, the crank on the public well never stopped groaning. The water level dropped from a dark gleam to a distant, muddy puddle. The murmur grew louder. Thirst gave fear a sharp edge. Colton Briggs and his men did nothing. They had their own well at the mine, deep and secure. The town's problem was not his. In fact, it was an opportunity. A thirsty man is a compliant man. Evelyn watched the growing desperation, the fights that broke out over a spilled bucket, the worried faces of mothers with listless children. The bloody thumbprint on the blank page haunted her. It was a message of finality, and she was certain its author was connected to the mine, to the ever-expanding web of control that was now strangling the town. She remembered the survey stakes she had seen from the broken stagecoach, a deliberate line marching across the landscape. They were not just marking land. They were marking a path to water. On the third morning, with the sun already a white-hot glare in the sky, She made a decision. She filled a canteen from May's dwindling barrel, tucked a small parcel of bread and dried meat into a satchel, and walked out of town, heading for the hills. She did not know what she was looking for. An underground spring, a hidden seep, anything. But she would follow the mine's markers. She would walk the path of the beast to see where it went to drink. The stakes were easy to find. Raw wooden posts driven into the hard earth every 100 yards or so. They led her away from the choked creek and up into the broken country of mesas and arroyos. The heat was suffocating. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of her boots and the labor of her own breathing. After 2 hours, the trail dipped into a narrow wash, thick with mesquite and sharp shadows. She pushed through a dense thicket, her eyes on the next stake, and did not see the ground give way. It happened in an instant. The earth beneath her right foot simply vanished. She cried out, pitching forward, her hands thrown out to break her fall. She landed hard on solid ground, but her leg was dangling in a dark, unnervously deep hole, the dirt crumbling around its edge, a trap, a pitfall, covered with a flimsy layer of branches and dust, meant for a deer or a coyote. She clawed at the ground, trying to pull herself back, but her foot was caught on a root. A wave of pure, cold terror washed through her. She was utterly alone, miles from town, about to be swallowed by the earth. A hand clamped down on her arm. It was not rough, but it was strong, with a power that stopped her frantic scrambling instantly. She was pulled backward, away from the precipice, with a smooth, irresistible force. She rolled over, gasping, and looked up into the still, unreadable face of Ta-Nat-Anii. He stood over her, a shadow against the blinding sun. He looked from her to the pit and back again, his expression unchanged. He said nothing. Evelyn's terror quickly curdled into a hot, unreasonable anger. She scrambled to her feet, brushing dirt from her skirt with shaking hands. "Did you see me? Were you just watching?" He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "I saw the stakes. This is not a path for you." "The town is dying of thirst," she shot back, her voice trembling with the adrenaline of her near fall. "Someone has to do something. Where have you been? You appear and disappear like a ghost. You leave medicine on doorsteps, but you will not show your face. You watch this town suffer and you do nothing. You are invisible when it matters." His dark eyes held hers, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something behind the stillness. It was a deep, weary sadness, as old as the stones around them. "You see thirsty people," he said, his voice low and even. "I see a sickness that water will not cure. I have watched your people come for 100 years. You take the grass, you take the trees, you take the mountains. Now you are taking the water from the heart of the land. When you have taken it all, you will die too. No one listens to the quiet words. They only listen when the land is silent forever." His words hit her with the force of a physical blow, stripping away her self-righteous anger and leaving her feeling small and foolish. He was right. The town's thirst was a symptom of the mine's greed, a greed that would not be slaked by one small spring. "Then what are we to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Just let them suffer. Let Briggs win." "Briggs is a coyote," Ta said. "He is only as strong as the fear he creates." He looked toward dry water, a dusty smudge in the distance. "You have a voice. They have started to listen to you. That is a weapon he does not understand." A strange, fragile understanding began to form between them in the silent heat of the wash. They were on different sides of a chasm, but they were both looking at the same enemy. "Help me," she said, the word coming out with more force than she intended. "I can speak for them, but I do not know this land. I do not know where to look. You do." He considered her for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were weighing her very soul. "There are places where the water is strong," he said finally, "and there are places that must not be disturbed. I will show you a path to water, but you will not take it. You will tell your people where it is, and you will tell them it is a gift from the land. not a prize to be stolen. If they disturb the sacred places, the water will die, and so will the trust between us. It was a truce, a fragile, conditional alliance. Evelyn nodded, accepting his terms. I will. He turned and began to walk, not back the way she had come, but deeper into the wilderness. She followed. He moved with a purpose that made the rugged landscape seem like a manicured garden. He showed her how to read the subtle signs of life, the direction of a game trail, the type of plants that grew only where their roots could find moisture. As the afternoon sun began to dip, they came upon a scene of quiet desperation. A section of a muddy, half-dry riverbed had become a trap. 4 wild horses, their coats caked with mud, were hopelessly mired, their struggles only serving to sink them deeper. They were exhausted, their eyes wide with terror. Evelyn's heart went out to them. We have to help them. Tas surveyed the scene, his face grim. The mud is deep. It is quicksand here. He gathered long, sturdy branches from a stand of cottonwoods, while Evelyn tore strips from her remaining petticoat, her earlier practicality giving way to a fierce desire to save these creatures. Working together, they laid the branches on the mud, creating a shaky but viable platform. Ta took the makeshift rope she had fashioned and, with a patience that seemed boundless, worked his way out toward the closest horse. He spoke to it in low, murmuring tones in his own language, calming it, stroking its neck until its frantic trembling subsided. He secured the rope around the horse's chest, and they pulled together. It was grueling work. The mud fought them for every inch, its suction immense, but slowly, painstakingly. The horse began to move. Its front hooves found purchase on the branches, and with a final, desperate lunge, it pulled itself free and staggered onto solid ground. They repeated the process 3 more times, their bodies aching, their clothes and skin covered in a thick layer of mud. By the time the last horse was free, the sun was a fiery smear on the horizon. The rescued animals stood nearby, not running, as if in gratitude, before finally turning and trotting away into the twilight. As they cleaned themselves as best they could at the edge of the wash, a new and profound respect had settled between them. They had worked as one, a seamless partnership of her determined heart and his quiet strength. Trust had been forged not with words, but with shared labor and a common goal. Just as darkness began to fall, the wind picked up, howling through the canyons. The sky turned a sickening shade of yellow-brown. A sandstorm. Ta grabbed her arm. We must find shelter. He led her at a run toward a dark cliff face, to a narrow opening she never would have noticed. They scrambled inside a small cave just as the full fury of the storm hit, a blinding, stinging wall of sand that scoured the landscape. Inside, the roar of the wind was muffled. Ta built a small fire near the mouth of the cave. In its flickering light, Evelyn saw that the walls were covered with ancient drawings, charcoal and ochre figures etched into the stone, animals she recognized, and strange, dancing humanoids, and one recurring image, a single figure, bent under the weight of a large pot, with lines radiating from it, lines of water, lines of life, a water carrier, a symbol of a shared burden, a sacred responsibility passed down through generations. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the fire, listening to the storm rage outside. It was a moment of profound peace, a sanctuary carved out of the heart of the violent world. My people have sheltered here for 1,000 years, Ta said softly, his eyes on the drawing of the water carrier. This land remembers everything. It remembers who honors it, and who brings it harm. As the storm began to subside, he led her from the cave. The air was clean and cool, the stars brilliant in the freshly washed sky. He pointed to a dark line of trees in a valley below them. Follow that line of sycamores. They drink from a spring that never fails. It is a long walk, but it is outside the canyon. It is not a sacred place. He was about to turn and leave, to melt back into the shadows as he had before. Wait, Evelyn said she had seen something snagged on a thorny bush at the very edge of the trail leading toward the forbidden canyon. She walked over and gently pulled it free, her breath caught in her throat. It was a small scrap of cloth, a blue and white patterned cotton. She knew it instantly. It was from the bandana William always wore tied around his neck, the one their aunt had made for him before he left home. She held it up. The firelight from the cave mouth caught it. Ta looked at the scrap, then at her face, and he understood. His expression hardened. William had not just been in dry water. He had been here. He had walked this very path and entered the canyon of quiet water, and he had not come out. Evelyn returned to dry water not with the triumphant fanfare of a savior, but with the quiet, heavy burden of knowledge. She held the scrap of William's bandana in her pocket, its familiar pattern a constant, painful reminder of her true purpose, as promised. She spoke to May first, then to a small, trusted group of miners that included Sage White, a prospector whose luck at cards was as bad as his heart was good. She described the location of the spring, drawing a map in the dirt floor of the boarding house kitchen, repeating Ta's words about the water being a gift from the land, not a prize. The news spread through the town like a cool breeze, a whisper of hope in the suffocating heat of their thirst. A party of men, armed with barrels and buckets, set out immediately, their steps lighter than they had been in days. They returned before evening, their containers full, their faces streaked with dust and sweat and wide with grins. For a day, a fragile sense of celebration settled over dry water. It did not last. Colton Briggs was not a man to let a solution exist if he did not control it. The next morning, a notice was posted outside the mine security office, written in a clerk's precise hand but signed with Briggs's authoritative scrawl. A water tax, a fee of 10 cents per bucket, payable to Red Butte Mining for the protection and maintenance of the town's new water source. For those who could not pay in cash, which was nearly everyone, the debt could be worked off. The company was opening a new exploratory tunnel. Tunnel 4. It was known to be unstable, a treacherous vein of fractured shale that the engineers had recommended reinforcing with extensive timbering. The notice made no mention of this. It simply offered a wage against the water tax for any man willing to take up a pick and shovel. It was not an offer. It was a death sentence on an installment plan. The town's brief joy curdled into a sullen, fearful anger. But fear was still the stronger emotion. Men with families to provide for lined up, their shoulders slumped, to sign their names on Briggs's ledger. Evelyn watched it all, a cold fury building inside her. This was the sickness Ta had spoken of, and it was poisoning everything. Her newfound sense of purpose drove her into the street. She began speaking to the women, organizing a rationing system, ensuring the children and the sick received water first. Her voice, calm and steady, became a small point of defiance in the face of Briggs's suffocating control. Her activity did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, as she was leaving Dr. Townsend's office, Deputy Hale stepped into her path. He was chewing on a toothpick, his smirk firmly in place. "Playing mother hen to the whole town. Are we—" "Miss Hart," he drawled, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Maybe you ought to be more careful. Little birds can get their wings clipped, meddling in things that do not concern them." He took a step closer, crowding her against the building's rough plank wall. "Mr. Briggs, he values order, and you are starting to look an awful lot like disorder." Evelyn stood her ground, her chin held high, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "And you, Deputy, look an awful lot like a bully." Before Hale could respond, the door to the boarding house next door swung open. May stood there, a heavy cast-iron skillet in one hand, her expression as hard as the metal she was holding. "Is there a problem here, Deputy?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Haley's smirk faltered. A few miners across the street had stopped, their attention fixed on the scene. A woman peered out from the general store. The public stage of the street was a powerful thing. "Just having a friendly conversation with the lady," Hale said, trying to recover his swagger. It did not look friendly from my window, May said, taking a step onto the boardwalk. The skillet did not waver. And I would hate for this skillet to slip and have an unfriendly conversation with your head. Now, I believe you have mine business to attend to, unless you mean to arrest my entire boarding house for loitering. Hale's eyes darted around at the silent, watching faces. He was Briggs's dog, but he was a coward without his master at his back. He spat the toothpick into the dust. "This is not over," he muttered, before turning and stalking away. Evelyn let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She gave May a grateful look. "Thank you." May just grunted. Bullies only understand one language. Now get inside before you invite more trouble. Dr. Townsend had witnessed the exchange from his window. When Evelyn came in to finish her work, he was waiting for her, his face a thundercloud. "I warned you," he snapped, slamming a book down on his desk. "This is what happens. You are poking a bear. Young lady, you think you are helping, but you are going to get yourself and others seriously hurt. Colton Briggs is not a man you cross. You are an outsider. You do not understand the way things are here. Go back to sweeping floors and leave the big problems to the men who made them." His words stung, but she saw the fear behind his anger. He was a man who had made his peace with the devil, and her defiance was upsetting that fragile truce. 2 days later, the devil sent his calling card. A miner's son came down with a raging fever and a violent sickness in his gut. Then another. Then a young woman who did the laundry for the saloons. The water in the town well, what little was left of it, had turned foul. Typhoid. The town, already weakened by thirst and fear, was wholly unprepared. Dr. Townsend was overwhelmed, his small office overflowing with the sick and dying. He worked himself to the point of collapse, his gruff demeanor cracking under the strain. It was Evelyn who took charge, with the help of Sister Agnes, a quiet nun who ran a small school for the town's children. She converted the little adobe chapel into a makeshift infirmary. The pews were pushed aside to make room for cots. May organized the healthy women, who began boiling every drop of water from the spring, creating a clean supply for the sick. The chapel bell, usually reserved for Sunday service, took on a new, grim purpose. It tolled each time another person was brought in, its mournful clang echoing the town's collective heartbeat of dread. Evelyn was tireless. She moved from cot to cot, cooling fevers with damp cloths, forcing broth and clean water between cracked lips, keeping vigil through the long, hot nights. She saw the community, which had been fractured by fear and suspicion, begin to coalesce into something new. It became a single organism fighting a common enemy. The miners who were not sick took turns hauling water. Sage White, having pawned his last valuable for medicine, turned out to be surprisingly gentle at spoon-feeding the weak. One evening, as she stepped outside the chapel for a breath of air, she found a deerskin pouch resting on the stone step, identical to the one that had been left for little Mateo. Inside were willow bark to fight the fever, pungent sagebrush leaves to cleanse the air, and a bundle of white sage. He was still watching. He was still helping, in his own silent, distant way. A fierce, protective instinct rose in her. Dr. Townsend had been right about one thing. If Briggs knew a Navajo was helping the town, he would use it as an excuse for violence, painting as a hostile agitator. She wanted to shout his name from the rooftops, to give him the credit he deserved, but she knew that to do so would be to sign his death warrant. Her silence was his shield. The quiet courage of her new ally demanded a quiet courage of her own. She brought the herbs inside and began brewing a bitter tea from the willow bark. The sickness, however, did not discriminate. On the 5th day of the outbreak, Dr. Townsend collapsed while lancing a boil. His skin was hot to the touch, his breathing shallow. Evelyn got him onto a cot, her heart sinking. He was old, and he was exhausted. For 2 days, she barely left his side. She bathed his face, forced the willow bark tea past his lips, and listened to his delirious muttering about medical school and a wife long dead. On the 3rd morning, his fever broke. He woke, weak and drenched in sweat, and saw her sitting in a chair beside him, her face pale with fatigue. He looked around at the clean, orderly rows of patients, at the quiet competence of the women tending to them. He looked at Evelyn, and for the first time, the sourness was gone from his expression, replaced by a grudging, profound respect.
"You did this,"
he rasped, his voice weak. "You organized all of this?" Evelyn just shook her head. "We all did." The same day, Sage White came to her, his face grim. He had been in the saloon, keeping his ears open. "There is talk. Evelyn, bad talk. A group of men are due in town, the Blacktail gang, hired gunslingers, every one of them. The rumor is Briggs hired them, says he needs extra security, but the boys think he is going to use them to clear the Navajo off the land around the canyon for good." The news hit her like a physical blow. The conflict was escalating. Briggs was no longer content with mere control. He was moving toward eradication. She thought of Ta, alone out there, and a new, sharper fear took hold. The Blacktails were notorious, and their leader was a man with a reputation for brutality. Worse, Sage had heard whispers that Ta and the Blacktails had a history, a blood feud from years past. That evening, the crisis took another dark turn. A prospector, leading his mule down from the hills, found a body half buried in a shallow grave a few miles from town. It was a male courier, a young man who rode the express line between Drywater and the next county. He had been shot in the back. Deputy Hale declared it a robbery, a tragic but common occurrence on the frontier. But the prospector had found something else. The courier's mailbag had been slashed open, its contents scattered, tucked inside the dead man's shirt, as if he had tried to hide it, was a folded piece of oilcloth, believing it to be important. The prospector had bypassed Hale and brought it directly to the one person in town he trusted to do the right thing. He brought it to Evelyn. Inside the chapel, by the light of a single lantern, she unfolded the oilcloth. It was a geological map of Tunnel 4. It showed the main shaft and the various crosscuts, but it was covered in spidery red lines, marking fissures and stress points in the rock. In the margin, in the same precise hand that had written the water tax notice, was a chilling notation: significant risk of catastrophic collapse without immediate shoring. Proceeding is not advised. Below it was a date from 2 weeks prior and the bold, unmistakable initials of Colton Briggs. He knew. He had known all along that the tunnel was a death trap. He had sent those desperate men, those fathers and sons, to work off their water debt in a tomb of his own making, fully aware that the mountain could come down on them at any moment. The murdered courier had been carrying the proof. The chapel bell began to toll outside, another victim of the fever being carried in from the night. But for Evelyn, its sound had changed. It was no longer just a bell for the sick. It was a bell for the dead, and for the dead who were still walking. It was tolling for justice. The map of Tunnel 4 was a death warrant, and the scrap of blue bandana was a tombstone. There was no more waiting, no more gathering quiet courage. The time for silence was over. Evelyn, her face set with a grim resolve that made her look older than her years, knew she had to go into the canyon of Quiet Water. She had to find what was left of William, and she had to find the truth. She showed the map to Sage White and 2 other miners, a quiet, steady man named Thomas and a younger, wirier man called Jacob. They looked at the red lines marking the fissures, at the engineer's dire warning, and a sick understanding dawned on their faces. They were not just being exploited. They were being treated as disposable. Their loyalty to the company died in that moment, replaced by a cold, hard anger. When she told them she was going into the canyon, they did not hesitate. "We are with you," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble. Finding Ta was the challenge. She did not know where he lived, how to summon him. She simply walked out to the lone juniper at the edge of town, the place she had seen him trading, and waited. She did not know if he would come. She only knew she had to trust that he would. as the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the land. He emerged from the twilight, as silent as a breath of wind. She did not need to explain much. She showed him the scrap of cloth. His eyes, dark and deep, held hers. He understood the need that drove her, the ghosts that could not be left to wander. Then she showed him the map. He studied it, his finger tracing the lines, and a muscle tightened in his jaw. This was the sickness he had spoken of, laid bare in ink and paper. He gave a slow, solemn nod. He would guide them. They set out before dawn, a small, grim party moving through the pre-dawn chill. Ta led them along paths that were invisible to Evelyn's eyes, through narrow gaps in the rock and along high, wind-swept ridges. He moved with a silent, fluid grace, a part of the land itself. As the sun rose, they stood at the entrance to the canyon of quiet water. It was a narrow slit in a towering wall of red rock, a gateway to a hidden world. A palpable sense of peace emanated from it, a quiet so profound it felt like a physical presence. This was a sacred place, and their presence felt like a profanation. Ta paused, closing his eyes for a moment, his lips moving in a silent prayer. He was asking for permission, not for them, but for himself, for bringing this trouble into a place of peace. Inside, the canyon was a world of its own, a tiny, clear stream, the source of the town's legends, trickled over smooth stones. Cottonwood trees, their leaves of vibrant green, grew along its banks. The air was cool and still, and their voices, when they spoke, were hushed, as if in a cathedral. The walls of the canyon soared hundreds of feet above them, the stones streaked with the dark desert varnish of millennia. It was beautiful, and it was deeply, unnervingly quiet. Ta pointed to scuff marks on the rock, a broken branch on a bush. "Men have been here," he said, his voice low. "Many men, with heavy boots. Briggs's his men." They moved deeper, Ta leading them toward a series of side canyons and caves, places a man might seek shelter or make a camp. Evelyn's heart pounded with a sickening mix of hope and dread. Every dark shadow looked like a body. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered name. They found the first signs of William's presence near a small, collapsed rock shelter. A rusted tin cup, a worn-out pickaxe with a nick in the handle she recognized, and a small, leather-bound book lying half-buried in the dirt. His journal. Her hands shook as she picked it up. She could not bring herself to open it. Not yet. She tucked it safely inside her satchel, a cold weight against her hip. As they rounded a narrow bend in the canyon, Ta suddenly stopped, holding up a hand. He motioned for them to be silent. He had seen something, a tripwire made of thin, dark cord stretched across the path. It was a recent addition. It was a trap. As he carefully disarmed it, a low rumble started deep within the earth. It grew quickly, a terrifying grinding of rock on rock. "Move!" Ta shouted, his voice cracking like a whip. The world dissolved into chaos. The canyon walls seemed to shudder, and a section of the cliff face above them broke away. Boulders the size of wagons crashed down, shaking the very ground they stood on. Dust billowed up, thick and choking, instantly turning the bright day into a suffocating twilight. They scrambled for cover, pressing themselves against the opposite wall as the rock slide thundered past, blocking the path they had just taken. When the last echoes died away, a new and more insidious threat emerged. A strange, metallic smell filled the air, sharp and cloying. It caught in the back of the throat, making their eyes water. "Bad air," Thomas rasped, his hand over his mouth. "From the deep rock, it is poison." Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. They were trapped between the rock slide and a creeping cloud of toxic gas. It was Ta who kept his head. He put his face to the rock wall, his eyes closed. "There is a wind," he said, his voice urgent. "A cool draft. It means there is another way out. Higher up, follow me, stay in the air that moves." He led them on a desperate scramble up a steep, treacherous rock fall. Following a current of air so faint that Evelyn could barely feel it on her cheek. But he felt it, guided by it as if it were a lighted path. They climbed, their lungs burning, the foul air nipping at their heels. They were nearing a ledge that promised a way out of the main canyon floor when Jacob, who was just ahead of Sage, dislodged a loose rock. It tumbled down, striking Sage's leg. He cried out, his leg buckling, his foot sliding into a narrow crevice between two large boulders. He was stuck fast. "My foot! It is trapped!" he yelled, his voice tight with pain and fear. Thomas and Jacob tried to move the rocks, but they were immense, wedged tight. The poisonous gas was rising, its acrid taste growing stronger. "We have to leave him," Jacob said, his eyes wide with panic. "No," Evelyn said, her voice sharp and clear. "We do not." She looked at Ta. "Is there a rope?" He nodded, already unwinding a coil of strong, braided leather from his shoulder. Evelyn took it. "I will go back for him. You find the way out. Get them to safety." Ta looked at her, his face a mask of stone. He saw the fire in her eyes, the stubborn refusal to abandon a friend. It was the same fire he had seen when she had stood up to him in the wash. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Be quick." Evelyn scrambled back down to Sage, the rope in her hand. "We will get you out," she said, her voice far calmer than she felt. It was then that new figures appeared through the swirling dust at the far end of the canyon. Colton Briggs, his face a grim caricature of satisfaction, stood with a half-dozen rough-looking men, the Blacktail gang. They had rifles in their hands. They had been following them all along. The tripwire, the rock slide. It had all been a trap. "Well, well," Briggs' voice boomed, unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. "Look what we have here. Trespassers, on company property." He raised his rifle. A shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the rock just above Evelyn's head. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack that was caught and thrown back by the canyon walls, echoing and re-echoing until it became a continuous, rolling thunder of noise. The concussions were so powerful they felt like physical blows, and more loose rock began to rain down from the cliffs. In the midst of the terrifying chaos, Ta acted. He was higher up, on a narrow ledge. He pulled a small, polished piece of metal from his pouch, a signal mirror. He caught the sun, sending a blinding flash of light directly into the eyes of the gunman. Another shot went wild. The gunmen, disoriented and blinded, began firing wildly, their bullets screaming through the canyon, the echoes amplifying their panic. It was the diversion Evelyn needed. While Briggs and his men were distracted, she worked frantically, securing the rope around Sage's chest. "Pull when I say," she yelled over the din. "Pull with everything you have." She took a deep breath, and on the count of 3, she and Sage pulled. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sickening scrape of bone and leather, his foot came free. She half-dragged, half-carried him toward the path Ta had found, scrambling upward as the gunmen below began to find their targets again. Ta and the others reached down, hauling them both onto the relative safety of the high ledge. They did not stop. They plunged into a narrow fissure in the rock, a dark tunnel that led them away from the gunfire and into the heart of the mountain. Emerging minutes later on a high bluff overlooking the canyon, they were safe. They had escaped. They found a sheltered spot to catch their breath and tend to Sage's badly injured foot. It was only then, as the adrenaline began to fade, that the full weight of her quest returned to Evelyn. William. She left the others and walked to the edge of the bluff. Below, in a small, secluded alcove partially hidden by a rock fall, she saw it, a patch of blue cloth, almost the same color as the bandana scrap in her pocket. It was the remains of a small, hastily abandoned camp, and beside it, a still form, partially covered by a canvas tarp. Her heart turned to ice. She knew, even before she began the slow, painful descent down the bluff, what she would find. Ta followed her, a silent, supportive shadow. He was there. William. What was left of him? He had been dead for months, his body mercifully preserved by the dry desert air. He looked peaceful, as if he had simply lain down to sleep. Evelyn knelt beside him, a great, silent scream building in her chest, a wave of grief so profound it threatened to shatter her. She had been too late. All this way, all this hope, and she had been too late. A torrent of guilt washed over her. She should have come sooner. She should have known something was wrong. She had failed him. She began to sob, deep, ragged breaths of pure anguish. Ta placed a hand on her shoulder. His touch was light, but grounding. "Do not let the dead rob the living of their reason," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Grief is a path, not a pit. You did not fail him. They did this to him." His words cut through her pain. He was right. Her grief was her own, but William's death belonged to them, to Briggs, to the mine. Her quest was not over. It had just begun. She saw the journal then, peeking out from under the edge of the tarp. It was the one she had found earlier, her hands no longer shaking. She opened it. The pages were stiff, stained with mud and water. But William's handwriting was clear. The last entries told the whole horrific story. He had not been prospecting. He had been hired by Briggs to place blasting charges in the canyon. Told it was for a new water tunnel for the town. He wrote of his unease, of the instability of the rock. The final entry was scrawled in a frantic, jerky hand. He had realized the truth too late. They were not blasting for a tunnel. They were conducting an experiment, a test to see if they could collapse the entire canyon entrance to seal it off, to hide what was inside. He was not a worker. He was a human marker, left to observe the blast from a supposedly safe distance. The last line was almost illegible. Briggs lied. It was not his order. The order came from Judge Whitcomb. He said the land must be secured, no matter the cost. Evelyn stared at the name, Judge Whitcomb, the most powerful legal authority in the entire district, a man known for his stern demeanor and his unshakable commitment to corporate expansion. The sickness was deeper and more rotten than she could ever have imagined. It did not just run the mine. It ran the courthouse. Her goal was no longer just to find a missing boy. It was to tear down an empire of lies, an empire built on the bones of men like her cousin. The truth was not just a foundation for justice. It was the only weapon she had left. They brought William's body back under the cover of a sky that had turned a bruised purple, the air thick and heavy with the promise of rain. It came just as they reached the edge of town, not a violent downpour, but a soft, steady drizzle, a rare and blessed event in that parched land. The rain fell on the dusty street, turning it to dark, slick mud. It whispered on the wooden roofs and washed the grit from the air, but it could not wash away the horror. The return of their small party was a silent, grim procession. Thomas and Jacob carried the canvas-wrapped body between them. Sage, his face pale and etched with pain, limped alongside, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch. Ta walked slightly apart, a silent, watchful presence, his eyes scanning the rooftops, the alleys, the faces that appeared in the windows, and then there was Evelyn, walking behind the body of her cousin, her dress torn and caked with mud, her hair matted with dust and sweat, a single, deep scratch running down her forearm. The whole town saw them. They saw the body, and they saw her face, and they understood that a terrible line had been crossed. Evelyn felt their eyes on her, 100 gazes of pity, of fear, of morbid curiosity. She wanted to be strong, to present a stoic front, but she could not stop the trembling in her hands. She felt exposed, stripped bare. Her private grief turned into a public spectacle. A profound sense of shame washed over her, an irrational feeling that this was somehow her fault, that her weakness was on display for all to see. May met them at the door of the boarding house, her usual sharp expression softened by a deep, maternal concern. She took one look at Evelyn's face and simply opened her arms. Evelyn collapsed into the embrace, the strength that had held her together for days finally shattering. She did not weep, but a long, shuddering tremor ran through her body, a storm of grief and shock and exhaustion that had no release. May led her inside, away from the watching eyes, away from the rain that now seemed to mock the dryness in her soul. Later that night, long after the town had fallen into a rain-hushed silence, Evelyn sat alone in the kitchen. A single lamp cast a warm, golden glow on the scrubbed wooden table. A cup of tea, brewed by May an hour earlier, sat untouched before her, its steam long gone. The body of her cousin lay in the cool storage room, awaiting a proper burial that now seemed impossible. The journal and the map were tucked away in her room, two pieces of a puzzle so dark she was afraid to look at them again. She was numb, hollowed out. The world had shrunk to the four walls of this quiet kitchen. She was staring at the scratch on her arm. It was inflamed, angry red lines streaking from the broken skin. She had cleaned it as best she could, but it throbbed with a dull, insistent pain. A floorboard creaked behind her. She did not startle. She knew, somehow, that it was him. Ta stood in the doorway, a shadow detached from the deeper shadows of the hall. He had not left. He moved into the room without a word, his moccasins making no sound on the wooden floor. He looked at the untouched tea, then at her, his gaze finally settling on her injured arm. He went to the counter where Dr. Townsend kept a small supply of medical provisions for the boarding house and came back with a clean cloth, a bowl of warm water, and a small jar of salve. He pulled a chair up beside her, not opposite, and gently took her arm. His touch was firm but incredibly gentle. Evelyn flinched, not from pain, but from the simple, unexpected act of kindness. He said nothing, simply began to clean the wound with a slow, methodical care. The warmth of the water was a comfort. The clean scent of the lye soap was grounding. They sat in silence, the only sounds the soft splash of water and the gentle rasp of the cloth against her skin. The quiet was not empty. It was filled with everything they had seen, everything they had survived together in the canyon. It was a silence that held more truth than words ever could. "I am sorry," she said, her voice a raw whisper, "for how I was when we came back, for falling apart in front of everyone. They looked to me to be strong, and I—" Her voice trailed off. She could not articulate the shame she felt, the sense of having failed some unspoken test of frontier womanhood. "Strong branches bend in the wind," he said, his voice as low and soft as the rain outside. He did not look at her, his attention focused on applying the cool, soothing salve to the scratch. Only the brittle ones break. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes. Not tears of grief, but of gratitude for his understanding. He saw her not as a weak woman, but as a person who had been bent to her limit. "I hate that they saw me like that," she confessed, the words tumbling out, "that Briggs saw me, shaking, frightened. He looks at people and sees only things he can use or break. And today, he saw that I could be broken." Ta finished wrapping a clean linen bandage around her arm, his movements precise and economical. He tied it off, and his hand lingered on her wrist for a moment. His skin was warm, his grip a silent reassurance. He finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers in the lamplight. "He did not see you. He said he saw a reflection of his own fear. Men like him build walls of power because they are terrified of what is inside them. They do not see people. They only see mirrors." In that moment, under his steady, quiet gaze, Evelyn felt the raw, jagged edges of her shame begin to smooth away. He was not just tending to a physical wound. He was tending to the deeper injury inside her, the one that felt raw and exposed to the world. A profound and terrifying vulnerability washed over her, a desire to strip away all the layers of pretense, all the armor she had so carefully constructed since arriving in this hard, unforgiving land. Her lips parted, and the words came out in a breath of pure, desperate honesty. A question that was also a plea, a metaphor for everything she felt.
Will you stay if I undress?
The question hung in the warm, still air of the kitchen, fragile and immense. She saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly followed by a deep, searching understanding. She rushed to explain, her cheeks flushing, suddenly afraid he had misunderstood. "I do not mean my dress," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I mean this." She touched her chest, just above her heart. "This armor, the part of me that pretends to be brave, that pretends to know what to do next, the part that feels like a failure because my cousin is dead and I could not save him. If I take all of that off, and I am just this, frightened and lost, will you stay then?" It was the most honest she had ever been, with another person, with herself. She had laid her soul bare on the scrubbed wooden table between them. Ta did not answer with words. He slowly raised his hand and touched the small deerskin pouch that hung around his neck, the one that held his sacred herbs, his connection to his own world of belief and strength. He held her gaze, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but a profound and solemn respect. He gave a single, deliberate nod. "I am already here," he whispered. The simple words were more powerful than any grand declaration. He was not promising to stay. He was stating a fact. He was already present, had been since the night he drove the wolves away. A quiet guardian watching from the shadows. The tension inside her, the fear of being abandoned in her moment of greatest weakness, finally released. She leaned forward, and he met her halfway. The kiss was not one of passion, but of deep, aching tenderness. It was as gentle as the rain, a soft meeting of lips that tasted of salt from her unshed tears and the clean, earthy scent of sage that clung to him. It was a confirmation, a sealing of the fragile. Powerful trust that had grown between them in the heart of the canyon. It was a promise of solace in a world that offered none. It was enough. A soft knock came at the kitchen door, followed by May's unmistakable voice, laced with her usual dry humor. "The tea is getting cold out here. Children. But it looks like things in here are warming up just fine. Do not mind me." The sound of her footsteps retreated down the hall. Evelyn and Ta pulled apart, a faint smile touching both their lips for the first time. The spell was broken, but the connection remained, stronger and more certain than before. The next morning, the rain had passed. The world outside was washed clean, the air crisp and clear. The grief for William was still a heavy weight in Evelyn's heart, but it was no longer a paralyzing one. The fear of Briggs and Whitcomb was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now balanced by a new and resolute strength. She was not alone. She met Ta in the gray light of dawn. They stood by the public well, the water level already a little higher from the night's rain. They looked at each other, the intimacy of the night before a silent, settled thing between them. There was a new purpose in their eyes. "We have to show them," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "The journal, the map. We have to tell the town what they did to William, what they are planning for the others." Ta nodded. "The truth is a bright light that makes the shadows run." As they were talking, a figure approached them from the doctor's office. It was Dr. Townsend. He looked older, more frail, but the sourness in his expression was gone, replaced by a look of weary humility. He stopped before Evelyn, twisting his hat in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. "Miss Hart," he began, his voice raspy, I have been a fool, an old, prideful fool." He finally looked at her, his eyes full of regret. "I saw what you did, in the chapel. I saw what you did for me. I was wrong, about you, about everything." He took a deep breath. "I heard what happened in the canyon. Sage told me about the bad air. I have seen the effects of that gas before. In other mines. The company always calls it an accident. William's journal, the map. They are proof, but they will say it is the word of a dead man and a girl against a judge." He straightened his shoulders, a spark of the old fire returning to his eyes. But this time it was aimed at a different target. "They will need more," he said. "They will need a man of medicine to explain what that poison does to a man's lungs. They will need an expert witness. I will testify. I will write a full medical report on the dangers of that tunnel and sign my name to it for all the world to see." Evelyn stared at him, stunned. An alliance from the most unexpected of places. The town was not just a collection of victims. It was beginning to fight back. The quiet courage was finding its voice. Dr. Townsend's declaration was the flint striking steel, and the spark it created ignited a fire in the small, huddled group in May's kitchen. Hope, which had been a fragile, flickering candle, now burned with a steady, determined flame. The room was no longer just a kitchen. It was a war room. The air buzzed with a nervous energy, a sense of purpose that pushed back against the encroaching darkness of fear. They laid the evidence on the table: William's mud-stained journal, the engineer's damning map of Tunnel 4, and Dr. Townsend's freshly penned medical report, his script precise and unequivocal, detailing the horrific effects of toxic gas inhalation. It was a powerful arsenal of truth, but they all knew that truth was not a weapon that could be fired like a gun. It had to be aimed, presented, and protected. "Whitcomb and Briggs will not just roll over," May said, her voice cutting through the quiet. She poured coffee for everyone. The familiar, comforting ritual a stark contrast to the gravity of their discussion. "They have money, guns, and the law in their pocket. We have a story. We need to make sure everyone hears it." A plan began to form. A three-pronged assault on the fortress of lies that Briggs and Whitcomb had built. It was a desperate gamble, relying on the courage of ordinary people against the organized power of the Red Butte Mining Company. The first front was legal, a battle for the hearts and minds of the public. May, with her deep roots in the community, and Sister Agnes, with her unimpeachable moral authority, would take the lead. They would go door to door, to the miners' shacks and the small homes, collecting sworn statements. They would document every injury, every threat, every man forced to work in Tunnel 4, every family driven into debt by the company store. Dr. Townsend's report would be the cornerstone of their case, to give William's journal official weight. They took it to Father Michael, the town's quiet, thoughtful priest. He read the last, desperate entry, his face growing pale. He made a meticulous copy of the key pages and, using the official seal of his chapel, stamped each one with wax, dating it and signing his name as a witness. It was not a legal document, but it was a testament, an act of bearing witness that carried a moral force all its own. The second front was tactical, a measure of protection against the inevitable retaliation. This fell to Ta. He understood that Briggs' power was rooted in his ability to inflict violence and control the land. He chose Thomas and Jacob, the two miners who had been in the canyon, to help him. They trusted him implicitly, having seen his skill and courage firsthand under the cloak of a moonless night. The three of them moved like ghosts toward the mine works, while his companions kept watch. Ta slipped into the shed where the blasting supplies were kept. He did not destroy anything. That would be too obvious, too easily discovered. Instead, with the deft, knowing touch of a man who understood the Earth's secrets, he made a subtle adjustment to the blasting machine's timing mechanism and carefully crimped the ends of the new blasting caps, rendering them inert. It was a quiet act of sabotage that would cause the next planned explosion to fail, buying them precious time. On the high ridges overlooking the dangerous tunnel, he showed Thomas how to build a signal fire that would produce a thick, black smoke, a clear warning of imminent collapse that could be seen for miles, a signal that could not be denied or hidden. The third front was the community's own survival. Evelyn knew that Briggs' control over the water was his most powerful weapon. She remembered seeing an old stone lined well behind the abandoned livery stable, choked with weeds and debris. She organized a crew of men who were too old or too frail to work the mines, but who still had strength in their arms and defiance in their hearts. Sage White, leaning on his crutch, became their enthusiastic, if hobbled, supervisor. They worked for 2 days, clearing the debris, reinforcing the stone lining, and replacing the rotten timbers. When they finally lowered a bucket and it came up brimming with clean, cool water, a ragged cheer went up. It was more than just water. It was a declaration of independence. They would not be held hostage by thirst. Dry water was beginning to provide for its own. The town was changing. The sullen fear that had permeated the streets was being replaced by a low, simmering buzz of shared purpose. People gathered in small groups, their conversations hushed but animated. They looked at each other with a new sense of solidarity. They were no longer just a collection of individuals struggling to survive. They were becoming a community. Colton Briggs felt the shift in the air, and it enraged him. His power depended on a populace that was divided and afraid. This burgeoning unity was a direct threat to his authority. He could not arrest the whole town, so he did the next best thing. He decided to cut off the head of the snake. Word must have reached Judge Whitcomb in the county seat, because the order came down with the swift, impersonal cruelty of a guillotine. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Evelyn Hart on the charge of inciting public disorder and sedition. Deputy Hale was given the honor of serving it. He swaggered into the center of town in the middle of the afternoon, flanked by two of the new, hard-faced men from the Blacktail gang. He clearly relished the moment, his smirk wider and more unpleasant than ever. He found Evelyn near the newly opened well, helping a young mother fill her buckets. "Evelyn Hart," Hale announced, his voice loud enough for everyone in the street to hear. "You are under arrest by the authority of Judge Whitcomb for conspiring to create a riot." A sudden, shocked silence fell over the street. Everyone stopped. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer ceased. The laughter from the saloon died. Every eye turned to the scene unfolding at the well. Evelyn's blood ran cold, but she stood her ground. On what grounds for giving people water? On the grounds that you are a meddling troublemaker who needs to be taught a lesson, Hale sneered, pulling a pair of iron manacles from his belt. "Now, are you going to come peacefully, or do my friends here need to persuade you?" He took a step toward her. In that instant, the world erupted into chaos. A piercing whistle cut through the air from a nearby rooftop. It was Ta. He had been watching. As Hale and his men looked up, startled, a heavy canvas awning above the general store suddenly collapsed, dropping a cloud of accumulated dust and a half-dozen stray cats onto the heads of the two black-tail gunmen. They sputtered and cursed, momentarily blinded and disoriented. "Run!" "Evelyn." It was May's voice, shouting from the doorway of the boarding house. Evelyn did not need to be told twice. She bolted, dodging around a water trough and heading for the narrow alleyway between the saloon and the blacksmith's shop. "Get her!" Hale roared, shoving a sputtering cat off his shoulder and starting after her. The chase was on. The marketplace, moments before a scene of quiet commerce, became an obstacle course. Evelyn ducked under a clothesline, sending shirts and undergarments fluttering into the faces of her pursuers. She knocked over a pyramid of canned peaches, sending them rolling under Hale's feet. The townspeople, who moments before had been frozen in fear, now seemed to find 100 small ways to get in the way. A mule suddenly decided to sit down in the middle of the street. An old prospector's walking stick somehow got tangled in a gunman's legs. As Hale rounded the corner into the alley, his face purple with rage, he came face to face with Sage White, who was standing there with an almost comical look of innocence, holding a large, open jar of his landlady's spiciest chili peppers. "Whoops," Sage said, as he pretended to stumble, sending the entire contents of the jar directly into Deputy Hale's face. The deputy let out a shriek that was half rage and half pure, unadulterated agony. He clawed at his eyes, which were instantly blinded by the fiery concoction, and staggered backward, cursing in a string of inventive and highly blasphemous phrases. The distraction gave Evelyn the time she needed. She scrambled through the alley, out the back, and into the relative safety of the warren of sheds and stables behind the main street. Ta was there, melting out of the shadows. He grabbed her hand, and together they vanished into the broken country at the edge of town. For a moment, it felt like a victory. They had defied Briggs, They had humiliated Hale. A small bubble of hysterical laughter rose in Evelyn's throat as she thought of the deputy's pepper-stained face. But their victory was short-lived. As dusk settled, the telegraph office at the edge of town began to click and clatter with an unusual urgency. The young operator, a nervous boy named Samuel, whose brother worked in Tunnel 4, received a message that made his blood run cold. He knew he was supposed to deliver it directly to the mine office, but his conscience, bolstered by the town's newfound courage, won out. He ran, the flimsy paper clutched in his hand, and found May at the boarding house. She read the message under the light of a lantern, her face growing grim. The bubble of laughter died in Evelyn's throat as she read it over May's shoulder. It was from Judge Whitcomb's clerk. It stated that, due to the recent unrest and the clear need for strong leadership to develop the territory, the judge would be personally arriving in Drywater the next day. He would be holding a special session to sign the final permits, officially expanding the Red Butte mining claim to include the entire watershed area, a tract of land that included the Canyon of Quietwater. The sacred land was to be legalized as company property. The signing was scheduled for noon. The ticking clock they had been racing against had just sped up. They did not have weeks to build a case. They did not have days. They had less than 24 hours before everything they had fought for was lost forever. Justice was no longer a matter for the distant future. It had to be won, or lost, by the time the sun reached its zenith tomorrow. The day of the judgment arrived with a white, searing heat that promised no mercy. The town saloon had been hastily converted into a district courtroom, but the smell of stale beer and desperation still clung to the wooden walls. Judge Whitcomb sat behind a makeshift bench, a large, imposing man whose black coat seemed to absorb all the light in the room, his face a mask of stern impatience. The space was packed with the people of Drywater, their faces grim, their bodies crammed together in the suffocating air. They were silent, watchful, a jury of the powerless. Outside, Colton Briggs stood with a dozen blacktail men, their presence a palpable threat. They were not there to keep the peace. They were there to enforce the verdict. Whitcomb began, his voice a low, authoritative rumble that tolerated no interruption. He spoke of progress, of the law, of the manifest destiny of companies like Red Butte to tame the wilderness for the good of the nation. It was a sermon of greed disguised as a legal proceeding. He dismissed the town's complaints as the grumblings of an unproductive and ungrateful populace. May was the first to speak for them. She stood, her voice clear and steady, and read from a list. It was a litany of the town's suffering, the names of men injured in unsafe shafts, the families driven from their homes by impossible debt, the children who had sickened from the bad water. With each name, a face in the crowd would nod, a wife would clench her fists, a father would stare at the floor. It was the simple, undeniable truth of their lives. Whitcomb waved a dismissive hand. Anecdotes and unsubstantiated claims. The company is not responsible for the personal misfortunes of its employees. Dr. Townsend went next. He was no longer the sour, defeated man he had been. He stood tall, his medical report held in a steady hand. He spoke in precise, clinical terms of hypoxia, of pulmonary edema, of the neurological damage caused by the gases found in the deep shale of Tunnel 4. He explained how the symptoms matched those of the men who had grown sick, and how they would have matched William Hart's had he survived the initial blast. "This is fanciful speculation, Doctor," Whitcomb said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have no proof this man was ever exposed to such a thing." That was Evelyn's cue. All eyes turned to her as she stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She placed the engineer's map on the bench in front of the judge. Then she opened William's journal. "My cousin, William Hart, was not a prospector," she said, her voice shaking slightly but carrying to every corner of the room. "He was hired by Mr. Briggs to place blasting charges. He kept a detailed record." She pointed to a diagram in the journal, a rough sketch of a tunnel with strange symbols marking the placement of the charges. "These symbols, Your Honor, which he recorded a week before his death, are identical to the fissure markings on the engineer's map. A map that clearly states there is a significant risk of catastrophic collapse. A collective gasp went through the room. The connection was undeniable. A line drawn in blood and ink from the company's negligence directly to a dead man. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Whitcomb's face. He looked from the journal to the map, then to the sea of hardened faces watching him. He saw that his legal pronouncements were losing their power. He was losing control of the narrative. He recovered quickly, his face hardening into a mask of judicial fury.
This is a circus,
he boomed, slamming his hand on the table. You present the ravings of a dead boy and call it evidence. You bring me rumors and hearsay and expect me to halt the wheels of progress. This is barbaric slander against a respected company and its officers. This hearing is over. The permits will be signed as scheduled. He banged a small wooden gavel, the sound a sharp, final crack in the tense silence. Case closed. But as the crowd began to murmur in angry disbelief, it was clear that nothing was closed. They had lost in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, the truth had been laid bare. Night fell, and with it came a different kind of judgment. The air, cooled by the memory of the recent rain, soon carried a new, acrid smell. Smoke. A flicker of orange appeared against the dark silhouette of the hills, a malevolent blossom of light that grew with terrifying speed. The new well, the shed holding their precious water barrels, was on fire. Briggs had made his move. It was a cruel, tactical strike, designed to break their spirit and blame the resulting chaos on an unseen enemy. A cry went up. It is the Navajo in attack, but the people of dry water, their eyes opened by the day's events, knew who the real enemy was. From a high ridge above the town, a pinpoint of light flashed, a brilliant pulse against the darkness. It flashed once, then twice. It was Ta. He was speaking with light. An answering flash came from another hill, and another. The signal was relayed. The miners he had prepared were coming. Down in the town, chaos reigned. The Blacktail gang, emboldened by the flames, moved to secure the street, firing their pistols into the air to sow panic, but their panic was met with a stubborn, organized resistance. Ta appeared at the edge of the blaze, directing a group of miners with a quiet, commanding authority. They did not fight the fire head-on. They fought it with the wisdom of the land. One group, armed with shovels, began digging a trench, a wide fire break in the dirt to starve the flames of fuel. Another group followed Ta as he used the narrow, confusing alleys of the town as a weapon. They made noise, created diversions, drawing a handful of the Blacktail men away from the main fire and deeper into the maze of back lots and sheds. The gunmen, confident in their numbers and firepower, charged recklessly into a narrow passage between the blacksmith and the tannery, only to find their way blocked by an overturned wagon. Before they could retreat, a wall of miners emerged from the shadows behind them. Sealing the trap, they were caught. Near the blaze, Evelyn was helping to organize a frantic bucket brigade, her face smudged with soot, her voice hoarse from shouting. She saw a familiar, weaselly figure emerge from the smoke, his face illuminated by the hellish orange light. It was Deputy Hale. His eyes, still red from his encounter with the chili peppers, were filled with a venomous hatred. He raised his pistol, its barrel pointed squarely at her.
This is for you, you meddling witch,
he hissed. In the fraction of a second before he could fire, a body slammed into Evelyn, knocking her to the ground. It was Sage. He cried out, a sharp grunt of pain. As the gun roared, he collapsed beside her, a dark stain spreading across his side. Hale raised the gun to fire again, but Evelyn, reacting on pure instinct, grabbed a heavy, discarded piece of a broken wagon wheel and swung it with all her might. The wood connected with Hale's arm with a sickening crack. The pistol flew from his grasp, and he staggered back, howling in pain, his arm hanging uselessly at his side. At the heart of the fire, the two leaders finally met. Briggs, a silhouette against the roaring flames, turned to find Ta standing before him. There were no words. This was a conflict that had gone far beyond language. Briggs charged, a bull of a man confident in his brute strength. But Ta was not a rock to be broken. He was water. He was wind. He sidestepped the charge, using Briggs's own momentum to send him stumbling. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. Briggs threw a punch that could have felled an ox, but Ta was no longer there, using a low branch to swing around him, kicking Briggs's legs out from under him. Briggs fell hard. The breath knocked from his lungs. Before he could recover, Ta was on him, using his own leather belt to bind the bigger man's wrists. It was not the victory of a stronger man, but of a smarter one. A man who was in harmony with his surroundings while Briggs sought only to dominate them. Ta did not kill him. Vengeance was not his way. Justice was... He rolled the helpless Briggs onto his back. He ripped the silver security badge from Briggs' chest, the symbol of his corrupt authority, and pinned it back on, upside down, a mark of ultimate shame. The fire was beginning to die down. Contained by the trench, the trapped gunman had surrendered. Hale was being tended to, his threat neutralized. As the smoke cleared, the people of Drywater began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the silence that had replaced the chaos. Then, a new sound began. The slow, deliberate tolling of the chapel bell. It was not a fire alarm. It was not a call to prayer. It was a summons. One by one, the townspeople gathered in the main street, their faces illuminated by the dying embers of the fire. They saw the captured blacktail men, a defeated and whimpering Hale, and at the center of it all, Colton Briggs, bound and shamed, his inverted badge glinting in the moonlight. They saw the truth, not in a courtroom, but written in soot and smoke and the quiet dignity of the men and women who had refused to be broken. They were all witnesses now. The dawn that followed the night of fire was unnervingly quiet. The smoke had cleared, leaving behind the blackened skeleton of the water station and the sharp, lingering smell of charred wood. The town of Drywater was in a state of suspended animation, the adrenaline of the fight replaced by a heavy, uncertain exhaustion. Briggs and his captured gunmen were locked in the blacksmith's forge, the strongest structure in town, guarded by a rotating shift of grim-faced miners. The consequences arrived not on horseback with guns blazing, but via the quiet, insistent clicking of the telegraph. Samuel, the young operator, had spent the night sending out a flurry of messages, not just to the county sheriff, but to the territorial capital. He had relayed Father Michael's witnessed account of the journal, a summary of Dr. Townsend's medical report, and a detailed description of the armed assault on the town, signed by May on behalf of the newly formed Citizens' Council. It was a flood of truth that could not be ignored. Late in the afternoon, a lone rider approached the town. He was not a soldier or a gunslinger. He was a United States Marshal, a tall, leathery man with weary eyes that had seen too much greed and violence. He introduced himself simply as Marshal Thompson. He did not come to take sides. He came to follow the evidence. He spent 2 days in Drywater, his presence a calming, authoritative force. He listened. He interviewed May, his pen scratching across the pages of his notebook as she detailed the company's campaign of intimidation. He spoke with Dr. Townsend, who walked him through the medical realities of Tunnel 4. He examined William's journal, comparing its crude diagrams to the engineer's map. He stood over the charred remains of the water station and then looked at the bound and sullen Colton Briggs. The evidence was overwhelming. A story written in fire, ink, and the resolute testimony of an entire town. The results came swiftly. A telegraph from the capital announced that, pending a full investigation, Judge Whitcomb was temporarily suspended from the bench. Marshal Thompson formally took Briggs and the remaining blacktail gunmen into federal custody, to be tried not for local disturbances, but for conspiracy, murder for hire, and interference with federal mail services. Deputy Hale, his arm in a sling and his pride in tatters, was unceremoniously stripped of his badge and told to leave the territory or face charges of his own. He was gone before sunset. A sense of profound, disbelieving relief settled over the town. The iron fist that had squeezed the life from them for so long had been unclenched. The dangerous mouth of Tunnel 4 was sealed by order of the marshal. A heavy timber and rock barrier erected to prevent any further loss of life. The work of rebuilding began, not with a sense of triumph, but with the quiet determination of survivors. The water station was the first priority, its reconstruction a symbol of their renewed independence. In the infirmary, which still occupied the chapel, Sage White woke up. The bullet had torn through his side, cracking a rib but missing anything vital. He had been lucky. The first person he saw was Evelyn, changing the dressing on his wound with a practiced, gentle touch. He looked around at the other patients, at the women quietly tending to them, and a look of profound shame crossed his face. "I spent my whole life chasing a lucky card," he rasped, his voice weak. "Never did a damn thing for anyone but myself." He looked at his own hands, calloused from a pickaxe but soft from disuse. "When I get back on my feet, I am done with it. Done with the cards, the dice, all of it. Thomas's father was a carpenter. I am going to ask him to teach me. I want to build something for once, instead of just trying to win it." Later that day, Dr. Townsend was examining Sage's wound, with Evelyn assisting him. The old doctor worked in an uncharacteristic silence, his movements precise, his usual grumbling absent. He finished tying a new, clean bandage and straightened up, avoiding Evelyn's eyes. "Clean stitch work," he mumbled, looking at the wall. "Good tension. Better than I could have managed with my hands shaking." He cleared his throat, a loud, awkward sound in the quiet room. "I was wrong. Miss Hart. About you. About everything." He finally forced himself to look at her, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and genuine contrition. "This town. It is a better place because you meddled. I was a fool not to see it." The apology, so unadorned and so clearly difficult for him, meant more to Evelyn than any flowery speech could have. "Thank you, Doctor," she said softly. "We were all just doing what had to be done." A quiet, unspoken partnership formed between them in that moment. The old, cynical doctor and the young, determined woman, united in the shared work of healing. A few days later, when the dust had truly settled and a fragile peace had returned, Ta came to her. He did not speak, but his eyes asked a question. She understood. She followed him out of town, away from the sounds of hammering and the murmur of human voices, back toward the silent, ancient stones of the high country. They walked for hours, their journey a mirror of their first trip, but this time there was no desperation, only a quiet, shared purpose. When they reached the entrance to the canyon of quiet water, Ta stopped. He took from his pouch a small bundle of white sage and a single eagle feather. He lit the sage, its clean, pungent smoke rising in a thin column into the still air. He murmured quiet words in his own language, words of apology for the violence they had brought to this place, and words of gratitude for the sanctuary it had provided. He was not just entering the canyon. He was asking its permission, acknowledging that he was a guest, not a master. He led her to the small, clear stream that ran through the heart of the canyon. He knelt and cupped his hands, but then stopped. He pointed to a shallow depression in a large, flat rock beside the stream, a natural bowl that had been worn smooth by centuries of flowing water. It was filled with water so clear it was almost invisible. He motioned for her to look. She knelt beside him, and in the still surface of the water, she saw her own reflection. It was not the face of the lost, frightened girl who had arrived on the stagecoach. This face was thinner, smudged with weariness, but her eyes were clear and steady. They held a knowledge, a strength she had not possessed before. Beside her own reflection, she saw his features serene and timeless as the rock itself. In that small bowl of water, they saw themselves, and they saw each other, with a clarity that stripped away all pretense. "This place is healing," she whispered. "The land is always healing," he replied, his voice a low murmur that seemed to be part of the canyon's silence. "It is people who forget how—" He dipped the eagle feather into the water and gently touched it to her bandaged forearm, then to her forehead. It was a blessing, a cleansing. They sat there for a long time, the silence comfortable and profound. They did not need to speak of the bond that had been forged between them in the crucible of fire and fear. It was as real and as solid as the rock beneath them. "What happens now?" Evelyn asked finally, her voice soft. Ta looked around, at the soaring red walls, at the ancient cottonwoods. "I will stay," he said. "This place will always need a guardian. There will be other men like Briggs. The sickness of greed does not die so easily. My path is here, to listen to the land and to protect it." Evelyn's heart felt a pang of sorrow, but it was a sorrow tempered with understanding. He was right. He was as much a part of this landscape as the saguaro and the stone. To ask him to leave would be to ask him to stop being himself. "And I have to stay in dry water," she said, the realization settling upon her not as a burden, but as a simple, profound truth. They need more than just water and a new town council. They need to heal too, to learn to trust each other, to build something that will last. He looked at her, and a rare, gentle smile touched his lips. "You are their guardian." It was not a farewell. It was an acknowledgement of their separate duties, their shared purpose. Their love was not a thing that could be confined to one small house or one small town. It was as vast and as open as the land itself, built on a foundation of respect for the boundaries that defined them. It was a love that understood that true connection did not mean erasing the space between two people, but honoring it. When they returned to town that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery colors, May was waiting for Evelyn on the porch of the boarding house. She was holding a piece of paper. "This came for you," she said, a proud smile on her face. "From Marshall Thompson. He sent it before he left." Evelyn took the document. It was an official permit, stamped with the seal of the territory, authorizing the establishment of a public school in the township of Drywater. Below that, in the marshal's own hand, was a handwritten addition, granting the school's teacher the authority to dispense basic medical aid and instruction. She looked at May, her eyes wide. Her dream, the one she had carried as a secret, desperate hope, was now a reality, written on a piece of paper, earned through fire and courage. "It seems you have found your calling, Miss Hart," May said, her eyes twinkling. "You can teach the children to read and write, teach them their history, and maybe," she added, her voice dropping to a more meaningful tone, "you can teach the children of the town and the children of the Navajo that the water tastes the same, no matter whose hands draw it from the well." The months that followed were not marked by a single dramatic event, but by 1,000 small, quiet acts of change. Drywater began to transform, breathing with a new and steady rhythm. The raw, desperate wound on the landscape started to heal, slowly knitting itself into a community. A town council was formed, with May, her sharp wit and even sharper sense of justice, unanimously elected as its head. Their first act was to draft a charter for the fair and equal distribution of water, a document that guaranteed no one would ever be held hostage by thirst again. The small adobe building that had once been the mine security office, the seat of Briggs's power, was scrubbed clean and repurposed. It became a shared infirmary and apothecary, a place of healing that embodied the town's new spirit. One side was lined with shelves of glass bottles and neat linen bandages, overseen by Evelyn with Dr. Townsend acting as a consulting physician. The other side was filled with bundles of dried herbs, roots, and bark, their earthy, pungent scents mingling in the air. Ta would come in the quiet hours of the morning, leaving fresh supplies of willow bark for fevers or comfrey root for mending bones, his silent contributions a cornerstone of the town's well-being. The people of Drywater, who had once viewed his knowledge with suspicion, now accepted his gifts with a quiet, profound gratitude. William was laid to rest in a small plot behind the chapel, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross carved by Sage White, whose hands were growing steady and skilled with a carpenter's tools. The whole town attended the service, a solemn gathering that was not just a mourning for one lost boy, but a final farewell to the era of fear he had represented. The true celebration of their new life came in the spring. It was not a loud or boisterous affair, but a simple, quiet ceremony by the banks of the mended irrigation ditch. The entire town gathered, and each family was given a young willow sapling. Together, they planted the trees along the waterway, their roots reaching down toward the life-giving moisture. It was an act of faith, a promise to the future, a planting of roots in the community they were building together. Sister Agnes, her gentle face illuminated by the soft afternoon light, offered a simple prayer of thanks for the water, for the community, and for the chance to begin anew. When she was finished, a silence fell, and a new figure stepped forward. He was a Navajo elder, a friend of Ta's, his face a beautiful, intricate map of a long life. He looked at the newly planted trees, at the flowing water, and at the faces of the townspeople. Then he began to sing. It was not a song of worship, but a song of kinship, a song that told the story of the water, of its journey from the sky to the mountain springs, of its sacred duty to give life to all beings, from the smallest insect to the tallest tree, to the Navajo and the newcomer alike. The two prayers, one of words and one of song, mingled in the quiet air, weaving a bridge of understanding between two worlds. That evening, Evelyn sat on the porch of the small cabin that was now both her home and the town's schoolhouse. The first rough benches and chalkboards were inside, ready for the children who would arrive in the morning. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the sweet perfume of desert blossoms, a blanket of stars. So vast and brilliant it seemed you could reach out and touch it, was spread across the sky. She was not alone. Taz sat with her, not on a separate chair, but on the top step beside her, their shoulders almost touching. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the Milky Way, a great shimmering river of light, flow across the dark expanse. The quiet between them was no longer a space to be filled, but a sanctuary to be shared. Evelyn thought back to that night in the kitchen, the night of the rain, the night she had felt so broken and exposed. She remembered the question she had asked, a desperate plea born of shame and fear. The memory no longer made her feel weak. It felt like a lifetime ago, a shedding of an old skin. The fear was still there, a small, quiet ember in her heart, but it was no longer a fear of her own weakness. It was the fear that comes with having something precious to lose. She turned to him, her voice a soft murmur in the vast desert night. She whispered the old words, but filled them with a new and deeper meaning. "If I shed every layer of fear," she asked, her eyes searching his in the starlight, "all the worry about tomorrow, all the ghosts of yesterday, will you stay?" He did not answer immediately. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a warm, solid presence. A slow, gentle smile spread across his face, a smile that reached all the way to his dark, steady eyes. "Evelyn," he said, his voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. "I have been staying since the night you asked me to be honest." He had stayed through the fires, through the fevers, through the fight for justice. He had stayed when it was hard and when it was dangerous. He was still here. He had chosen to stay. Her heart, which she had thought was finally at peace, seemed to swell with a love so profound it left her breathless. This was the truth of it. Love was not a dramatic arrival or a desperate plea. It was a quiet choice, made again and again, day after day. It was the choice to stay. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. They sat like that for a long time, two small figures on a small porch, under an immense and beautiful sky, their separate paths having led them to this single, perfect moment of peace. In the town below, the public well was full, its water a dark, silent mirror reflecting the stars above. And in the chapel, the bell hung quiet in its steeple. Its rope was still. It did not ring for fires, or for fevers, or for fear. It was silent, its job complete, listening only to the steady, peaceful heartbeat of the town that had, against all odds, learned to heal itself. Thank you for listening to the story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.